Good morning again. I'm Monty. Really, I'm glad that you're here and for this webinar, Moving from Recovery to Renewal with the Community Initiatives team. And on behalf of the other conveners, in particular, our friends at Rethink Health, we're really excited to have you here, excited about, I think, the next hour in front of us. I think you'll find it interesting and I think really informative for kind of helping everybody discover their role in this important time for moving from recovery to renewal. So would love for folks, if you wouldn't mind, to kind of chat your name, your organization, perhaps your community as you're coming in to this space. And our focus is really around this question of, given the unprecedented investments, federal investments in state and territories and tribal and local communities, given what is really never seen before, the amount of flexible funding for communities and the scale of that investment, how do we take advantage of this in ways that would move us to accelerate us to more equitable well-being, to a place where all people are thriving? And so that's the big question, and we're fortunate to have four speakers with us, individuals and who represent organizations that are in the middle of this big question, not just thinking about it, but really intersecting between the federal agencies and local communities and policymakers. And so they're going to help us really get a better sense of what the opportunities are, where we are. If folks could put yourselves on mute, if you wouldn't mind, just in case, that'd be appreciated. And so this is in many ways a setup to what we're planning for on March 3rd, of a deeper conversation where we're working and learning from communities on March 3rd. So excited about this as really kind of a two-step process. And also, really encourage you to be listening in, but also, participating via chat, questions, ideas, resources that you know of. And Stacey Wegley from our Community Initiatives team is going to be actively monitoring and supporting the chat, as is Bobby Milstein from Rethink Health. I hope both of them will feel free to kind of play color commentary as well as we kind of move through the hour. So again, really glad that you're here. And I'm going to just offer up just a little bit of context for the Thriving Together kind of framework before we kind of jump in and invite our speakers. So as some of you know, this really has been a collective effort to focus on reducing struggling and suffering and really elevating equitable well-being for all. And this unique pairing of kind of non-governmental actions with coordinated federal actions is really what's started to kind of emerge through the Thriving approach. And so we did a webinar, I know, last year, just to remind folks that in many ways what has emerged through the Thriving Together framework is really informing the long-term recovery and resilience work, the equitable long-term recovery and resilience work through the interagency work that is made up of approximately 30 federal agencies that are using this as a basis to kind of plan for the long-term resilience. And it was really born from some inquiry with a wide range of NGOs, many of you who are on the call now. And maybe go to the next slide for me, please, Elizabeth. So yeah, it started with this inquiry. I mean, the compounding crisis that we have all experienced and observed starting in 2020, the question of how do we really convert, profound loss into renewal? And it started with the premise of how do we, really build into the reserve of resilience that's embedded in American communities and start to organize local and national efforts around a measurable North Star goal of all people in all places thriving, no exceptions. And so that's kind of how the Thriving Together framework took off. And as many of you know, I think on this next slide here, a little bit of a visual vocabulary. I think increasingly we're starting to see some traction around the 7 vital conditions that in many ways are pretty self-explanatory, and really looking at these being the vital conditions that all people around the globe, no matter their age or where they are in their life course, need on a consistent basis to experience well-being, to experience thriving. So thriving natural world, freedom from access to sustainable resources and freedom from climate harms and the basic needs that's made up of public health, infrastructure, and routine access to healthcare, and freedom from harm and addiction, and humane housing, and meaningful work and wealth. All of these pieces that, again, in many ways we know intuitively from experience, but there's enormous decades and decades of research that tells us that these vital conditions are what conspire or not to really create the conditions for individual and collective well-being. I'll just double click on that bottom one, is the belonging and civic muscle. I think that's one of the unique vital conditions. It's both a vital condition, and it's also really a strategic lever by which it animates all these other vital conditions. So we know that people's sense of belonging, their ability to contribute to their communities, to society, is a really important part of well-being. And we also know that the collective agency, our ability to work across differences to shape our futures, is really an important vital condition, again, that enlivens the others. So we had a lot of this thriving together framework was crowdsourced wisdom, as we like to say. We had leading non-governmental organizations. I see some folks from Institute for Healthcare Improvement, Transportation for America, Prosperity Now, that all came together to really help us understand this moment and how we might pivot and start to act in some new ways in the short term and the long run to really reach this North Star of all people in all places thriving. And in the center there, just the reminder that these are the vital conditions that really drive thriving, suffering, and struggling. And when they have not come together, when they don't add up, then we see more suffering and struggling. And so this situating this around thriving and really recognizing, as you can see, that line of legacies, the legacies that we've inherited from our ancestors have a lot to bear on how we are experiencing today and how we might think about moving forward together in the future. So legacies of inclusion, legacies of dignity, of human rights and advancements and innovations and institutions that really support our collective well-being, but also legacies of exclusion and harm and trauma. And I think we increasingly see that where there's opportunities to acknowledge these legacies, and we're seeing it through land acknowledgements in local communities about the harms of Native Americans and our neighbors that for many generations are still suffering the impact of injustice. So there's an opportunity to take these legacies and really think about shaping new legacies for all people in all places thriving. I think Shoma's going to talk a little bit more about that. So that's the broader ethos by which we think this larger frame is an opportunity to really see this moment with federal investments, and why we started to create a resource out of Thriving Together for this equitable recovery and renewal. Would love to maybe just do a quick poll to get a sense of kind of how people are coming into this space. So if you could, I think there's a poll question around kind of what level, where do you usually work? Neighborhood, city, county, statewide, nationwide, and then, how much effort are you putting into or in spending on moving from short-term recovery to renewal? So great seeing some of you popping in there. Looking at the list of who had signed in, it seemed like we have a really beautifully eclectic mix of folks bringing in, just as the poll would suggest, kind of a fairly well balanced in some ways, number at the neighborhood, a lot at city, county, multi-region. Yeah, some nationwide. And I suspect for many of you, you're wearing multiple hats. And none to almost all. So really interesting mix for our speakers to kind of be thinking about the audience that we're looking at. And I think, again, for those of you who are here, we're going to have a chance to really hear from some speakers that are spending the bulk of their time in a lot of organizations in this area. So next slide, please. Thank you for that. So again, there's a resource, this platform on Thriving Together to really explore pragmatic tools for moving from recovery to renewal that some of you may have already explored. We hope that you will. We want to continue to curate that. This meeting will be on that, and we'll continue to be gathering resources. Next slide, please.
Go back if you want to do that.
So
Okay, is nothing real urgent?
I don't know if we can mute that. Oh, thank you. So this is just a kind of a quick view of how the contents are organized on this page. I won't completely unpack this, just to know that there's lots of great resources around what communities are doing, what resources are available, and some actionable resources as you move towards the bottom of the page. Next slide, please. And I think one of the things that we are hearing, and I think you'll probably hear these threads throughout our time together, is this is an opportunity to really dream big, to slow down, center equity. And I think all of those actually go hand in hand. It's an opportunity, again, to do that in ways that is not just top-down investment, but to build belonging and civic muscle, to see this as a really unique moment in time, these unprecedented resources, to really think about how we act as shared stewards. And it comes along with, also measuring what matters. So on that note, I trust and hope my colleague, Shoma Vashaha, who is executive lead of Wellbeing and Equity in the World and also a partner in the Wellbeing of the Nation Network. And as you can see from this quote, which I think is a nice way to kick this over to Shoma, is this is an opportunity not to really invest in some different ways, to act in some different ways, so that we're not duplicating, replicating the systems of inequity that many of us are experiencing today. So Shoma, are you with us to kind of share a little bit of your insight and your experience and what you're seeing today?
Monty, can you hear me?
I can. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, it just brings my heart joy to see all of so many of you who are working to make the shift from our everyday reactive system to one that's grounded in renewing and creating a new vision for what an equitable system founded on well-being for everyone can be. Next slide. So many of you who have been with us, this act of renewal isn't an act of one group of people. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about our experience moving some of this work in a couple of places in our work in the Wellbeing in the Nation Network, and also how that showed up in the context of hundreds of communities that are engaged in RISE, and more as a here's an example of how this is showing up in the ground and what we're learning from communities that are engaged in this journey. But our work at the Wellbeing in the Nation Network begins with that recognition that you can't actually solve the problems today. We're just like playing whack-a-mole with symptoms of inequity that are manifesting in the world if we don't understand the root cause of what's creating the illness in the first place. And those root causes have to do with our legacies of structural exclusion of people based on race and class, and whether we prioritize urban and rural divides, all kinds of things. But it's that if we don't understand how things like racism and colonialism play into the systems we have, we will play whack-a-mole forever and not create the conditions for everyone to have the vital conditions they need on sexism and many other forms of exclusion, Kirsten. So so in this work, we know that what we care about at the end is more people thriving, actually all people thriving, and people not struggling and suffering, at least not from structural and systemic harm. And so as we think about that, we've been spending a lot of our time knowing that in this current moment of the pandemic, so many people are caught in adversity based on life and based on their health. And so much of our approach to them has been around people need real help today. And if we continue to only see that as a reactive response, if we don't use this as an opportunity to reclaim the story and the narrative about how we got here, and to lay a long-term path toward renewal of the policy structures and systems that is built on creating those vital conditions that everyone needs to be thriving together. And if we don't do that in relationship with communities, we're not going to get there. So a big strategic move that we made at We in the World in the context of the WIN network was to lean into a journey to see if in partnership with the CDC and HRSA, some of the dollars that were coming in could be used to create a very different kind of response in communities that gave people permission to, yes, meet people's needs today, but to lay some of that path toward long-term renewal in the future, for even the present day and for the future. If you go to the next slide, and I wanted to just share a little bit about what we've been learning in the context of that experience. So the initiative was called RISE, which is about reach, immunizations, and system change for equity, and begins with this idea, if you think about belonging and civic muscle, that equitable recovery is built on trust, and that requires a transforming of our relationships, power dynamics, and their systems, into creating the conditions for everyone to thrive. If you go to the next slide. So RISE we started by saying this can't be done alone. How do we bring ourselves in proximity with organizations across the country that are motivated around this? And as we reached out, we found organizations like Chromatic Black, who are made up of 10,000 Black artists and activists who are working to shift the master narrative, along with more traditional public health organizations that have been working with groups experiencing inequities like the Migrant Clinicians Network and Latino Health Access that created the promotora model for 20 to 30 years, to groups like Meals on Wheels and US Aging and others. And by coming together along with the Public Health Institute and others, we began thinking very differently about what this could look like. If you go to the next slide. So as we began to do this, the three things we realized we needed that are, if we're going to have a process that builds renewal, we needed to start by building trust. And that meant not just asking people to trust us, it meant showing real trust. And that meant getting resources out to those communities and those trusted leaders and communities, and trusting them to lead the response, and engaging, shifting the balance of power so that their ideas, voices, and policies around system change could help inform what we do. A second part was investing in deepening civic capacity and civic systems. For example, to use data for power rather than data for reporting. And what does that look like when we flip the model about both the data that's being collected, but the data that's being prioritized? What does it look like to build civic capacity around information and disinformation and narrative change as part of an equitable response? And finally, we very intentionally partnered with groups like the Center for Popular Democracy that reaches, it's the largest organization reaching grassroots organizers on the ground who are working to transform systems of injustice. And we're able to ask everybody who got out the vote for Black Voters Matter, to Fair Count and others, to actually resource them to meet the needs of their communities. And we committed, maybe not in the context of the specific federal piece, that we would help them get out the vote and assure the right to vote for everyone. That idea of systems connecting together to build the long-term strategies for renewal that are needed. If you go to the next slide, that commitment to transform systems. And I wanted to just spend the rest of my few minutes here just telling you a little bit of stories of what we learned. Of course, part of what we learned is, yep, those who are closest to the ground are the smartest and most effective at knowing what their communities need and mobilizing, smart, creative strategies to be able to do that. So in the last 6 months, this collective has gotten the word out and reached over 30.8 million people, and in using really creative strategies, knowing that people who are agricultural farm workers are actually don't have a lot of access to broadband or even smartphones, getting messages out through radio and having them, especially as they're working often for resistant ranchers to vaccinations, getting them out to places which are they know as safe to be able to get connected. And instead of saying, yep, this is a vaccine effort, we said this is a well-being effort. We give them simple tools to quickly assess people's well-being and actually connect them to resources to support their overall needs for mental, physical, social, and spiritual well-being together, and financial well-being. And that idea that if we want people to, if we expect people to show up for vaccinations, actually we need to be trustworthy in meeting their overall needs for life is huge. One of the really powerful things we've been able to do is give people that data back right away. for their own communities, so they can actually manage and drive a response. And what's been fascinating is to see the way in which people have used well-being as a frame, have really seen the value of doing what they call well-being temperature checks of their community, and using that to inform a policy and system change agenda going forward with real-time data to drive that response. The second thing that we've been able to do is help people, give not just permission, but resource people to come together to build civic capacity across organizations, to build greater regional vision and power. As Reverend Richard Joyner said in Eastern North Carolina, it gave us the opportunity to create something that united us. And what they're doing out of that is creating transformative models of not just policy change, but economic development and community change that they have always hungered to do. But now this gives them an opportunity to build that into what they're doing. There's a group in North Dakota, in Pine Ridge, that are an indigenous community in Lakota Nation that's using this to restore indigenous conceptions of well-being into the K-12 schools as part of long-term reclamation. And I think giving people just a little tiny bit of permission to do what they are hungry to do, especially as trusted leaders within their communities. I think we need to redefine who a system change leader is, because I don't know anyone who's more motivated or more clear about how the system needs to change than those who are there. And apparently also my dog Orla, who has lots to say about this. And then the last part is, like, if you see that last slide, in hearing and giving people room to grow, and say what it means to them. What people think about this as a campaign around health and equity and vaccinations has shifted. For Chromatic Black, this was talking and telling stories and pictures of what this means. And out of that, there's a whole campaign called Keep Black Love Alive that became their theme. And it's a campaign of both, yes, getting people connected to vaccinations, but connected with vaccine sites, with expungement clinics that remove fees and fines, that get people access to housing and makes them aware of their rights as tenants. They're multi-solver events rather than single solver events. And they're opportunities for people to tell their COVID love stories, but also their truth stories, so that we're not asking people to just trust us, we're actually inviting their own narratives about where things have gone wrong in the system, and building that civic muscle for being able to tell those stories at scale to one another. Go to the next slide. As they've done that, they've activated civic networks that are truly shifting what they're doing. This happens to be about this kind of implementation in Delaware, but in this case, they were able to actually shift the percent of people, monitor how many people were thriving and who was struggling and suffering, and see if they could move the percent of people that were struggling and suffering down. And in relationship with those people, use that to change the systems. And in this case, they were able to get police to take people out of booking and incarceration into a treatment pathway for mental health disorders in a state that has a 15% higher rate of Black and Brown people in jails than the national average, which is already unconscionably high. They were able to reduce short-term pieces around homelessness, but turn that over time into a conversation about how do we sustain these gains in the long term. And I think those are the kinds of things that we're looking to help people do, so that they can marry the short-term response with longer-term strategies around renewal. If you go to the next slide. As we've been doing this work, one of the things we've been doing is using the thought leadership of so many of you from Thriving Together, but also from the springboard that you all wrote about, those pivotal moves and opportunities for system change, to give people actionable tools and strategies to embed systemic change responses. And you'll notice, for example, incarceration and immigrant detention as a part of that, along with safety of workers and overall worker rights, et cetera. So it's part of like helping people to take some of those system changes, along with the equitable economies database and civic infrastructure tools, to take more systemic action. And I think that's the part that we're really excited about as we build a network that is working to make renewal a part of the norm of how we create change. If you go to the next slide, I think what we have the opportunity to do is to say, how do our pieces all come together to support the hundreds of communities now that are in action to begin to know what they need to do, but also how we support and create the enabling conditions to make those real. And I think that's where we need a connected network. I think that's why we need to come together, not just so that not only are those communities connected to each other, but how can everything that Policy Link knows and the Georgia Health Policy Center knows, everything that you're learning in the Poverty Action Lab or in Civic Peace, how can all of the tools and assets come together to make possible a path to renewal that is driven by the voices of communities?
Beautiful. Thank you, Shoma, as you often do, really helping to lift up the bright spots and what we can learn from those bright spots, how we get out of this game of whack-a-mole, which we're going to do if we keep doing the same things we've been doing, and just really who are our systems change leaders, and really redefining what that looks like, and those that are closest to the problem if we're going to really create just and transformational change at the community level. So, and I definitely want to pull on this thread again, and what does it look like for us to be learning together as a network? We have to be learning and doing this together. So on that note, I would love to invite in 3 leaders and organizations that are doing really extraordinary work across the country to kind of give us a sense of where we are in this movement, and really the investment of a plural set of national resources. So Sarah Truhaft, maybe just to quickly get everybody's voice in, kind of your name or a little bit more, what brings you to this work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Sarah Truhaft, Vice President of Research at Policy Link. We are a national research and action institute based in Oakland, but work across the country. And our mission is advancing racial and economic equity. And our tagline is, by lifting up what works. We have a strong connection to grassroots organizations and folks like you all who are working on the ground for change in their communities and try to scale that up through policy. I would say, I kind of come to this work having grown up in Toledo, Ohio, an older industrial city, and seeing segregation in the city and not understanding, what were the real historical roots of that. And then I ended up learning about it in planning school, and learning about redlining and learning about urban renewal and all of the racist policies that really created these places, like created my city and create these inequitable geographies that we see everywhere in the United States. And so came to Policy Link to work on those issues. And Policy Link, just in terms of getting into this conversation around recovery, renewal, we've been on a path to recognizing the need for policies that reach the scale of need, right? So we focus on the nearly 100 million people in this country who are economically insecure. How can we address that issue? That's nearly a third. So, recognizing clearly like small scale programs are not going to tackle that phenomenal issue that existed before the pandemic, right? So going into the pandemic, thinking about the scale of need, how do we, really following on what you've already stated, how do we address the urgent needs, but think toward the transformative solutions that we need, that we might not be able to get now, but how do we have some building blocks to get there along the way? So I'll stop there because I'll have more opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Sarah. It's hard to wrap my head around 100 million, that number, like you said, nearly a third of our population. That's pre-pandemic. I'm really glad you're here. Mike Wallace from National League of Cities.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to join you all today. I'm with the National League of Cities. National League of Cities is an association. It represents all 19,000 plus cities, towns, and villages across the United States, from the smallest which is a handful of people to the largest local governments. Our mission really is to help city leaders build better communities. We do that by working at the federal level, trying to improve the intergovernmental partnership, trying to improve coordination and cooperation. We do it at the local level with capacity building, trying to help cities learn from one another, help local elected officials individually sort of grow their own capacity and in their ability to do kinds of interventions in their communities to prevent decline, to help foster economic mobility and opportunity and racial equity. So we just sort of look at the governmental structure from top to bottom, federal to local, and try to make the different levels work together well, ultimately for the benefit of all the residents of the community.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And Karen Vineyard.
Hello, thank you so much for letting me be here today. I feel like this group is the perfect audience for what I would like to be able to say today. And when I think about this work, I see a future in which people and communities are able to use the unprecedented national, state, and local resources to pursue their dreams. And at the Georgia Health Policy Center, we have made a commitment to working to help make that happen. And later I'll tell a little bit more about that.
What brings you into this work?
Well, I think that for me, I have a long history of working in communities and working with the people on the ground, and I share Shoma's conviction that the answers are in the community. And I would like to see the communities have all the tools they possibly can to be able to realize what they want. And the Georgia Health Policy Center has a long history in working in this way and thinking about how to translate what's going on at the federal and state levels to people who really need the support to actualize what they'd like to do.
Thank you. Well, want to just ask a question to each of you, and again, for those of you who would like to continue to chime along, ask questions, any thoughts in the chat, welcome that. Sarah, we talked a few weeks ago, I think, and you were reminding me that PolicyLink was actively, not surprisingly, involved in some of the earlier recovery efforts, things such as Katrina, and learned a lot through some of those early recovery efforts, some good things that came out of that, and also some pretty tough lessons. And I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit about that and how that has informed the approach you started to kind of tee up in the introduction around how you're thinking about really doing this work at scale.
Yeah, I will start with the positive, the positive things, and then go into the lessons, right? So I think, so Katrina, I'm going to come back to Katrina around the lessons learned. But in terms of the last recovery, we worked really closely with the Obama administration, a friendly administration, not dissimilar to the one we have now, at least, right? We worked with them to build programs. So we worked with them to build the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which provided resources, planning and implementation resources to address actually the issues I was talking about, right? To address regional inequity, to build plans that were inclusive, that were about addressing climate change and environmental sustainability and shared prosperity. So we set up that program, and that has had some long-lasting impacts, I think, creating new coalitions, multi-sector coalitions, and suburban and urban coalitions and community-based organizations and the government agencies and the private sector even, to kind of set new frameworks for prosperity in regions. Also, we set up the Promise Neighborhoods Institute, which was a program, cradle to career pipelines. It was actually taking the Harlem Children's Zone model, which really proved that there was nothing wrong with the children growing up in Harlem. It's that the schools, like the systems and the neighborhoods and the school are inadequately serving people, and poverty. So if you address those things, kids succeed. And we, spread that to other places with resources from the federal government. And a lot of those efforts, which are, community-based services, they are now, or they were through the pandemic, connecting people with vaccinations. They were on the ground able to get information to communities that are harder to reach, harder to serve, marginalized communities, most impacted by the pandemic, right? So you could see the long-lasting structures that were put in place through those programs. Okay, so we also worked on Hurricane Katrina. And for this story in the lesson, I'm actually going to pull from my colleague, Ashley Gardier, who is now our executive vice president at PolicyLink. We worked with her when we went to Katrina. We were asked to come to New Orleans and support rebuilding after Hurricane Katrina. And Ashley was working in local government at that time, and we worked with her and set up an office to focus on rebuilding. So now she's at PolicyLink. So she wrote a reflection on that work, and I'm actually going to read a quote from her. And I think that we have this link, okay, to send around too. But she wrote about how hard New Orleans leaders worked to implement good programs and strategies, that they really effectively used the federal resources that were provided to them. But then she says that those efforts were, quote, no match for the nation's 400-year-old social, political, and economic structures introduced with the arrival of the first slave ships to New America's shores. Leaders continue to invest their best thinking and action without recognizing that the structures that govern our democracy and economy have been designed to exclude Black people and people of color, and as a result, limit the entire nation's progress. Despite our best intentions, as leaders, we employ race-neutral strategies expecting to achieve racial equity, convinced that a rising tide lifts all boats. So, I think it was such a powerful reflection. Here we did everything right, but, we're not really tackling these core issues. And how do we get to that, which I think is the segue into like how we're thinking about recovery now, and how we are trying to put in place building blocks, that kind of are stepping stones toward building an equitable economy and a democracy that actually works for everybody, includes everybody. So I think a couple things that I wanted to point out in terms of learnings beyond that super powerful quote is just how do we, like that, this question of who decides how we spend these federal resources? Who decides where the infrastructure is built? I think that is really critical to focus on right now, because we do have existing structures in communities, and they are quite frankly stacked with people who have had power, who have resources. They are, more likely to be white, so I think that it's like, how do we shift those power dynamics through the resources that are coming down now? And there are ample opportunities to do that in terms of how are you influencing programs that are being established that will decide on the use of resources, right? So who decides is, I think, really critical. And then, what are the rules that are going to guide investments? Are there local hiring requirements on infrastructure investments? What does contracting look like? What businesses are going to be engaged? So I think that thinking about who decides is really critical right now. And then what are the rules that are going to guide things? And those might be even rules around or guidance around data. What sort of analysis is being required for programs? and then ensuring that the analysis is looking at using disaggregated data to look at who has been left behind before, who is most impacted by structural racism as well as the pandemic. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Super powerful. That quote is incredibly powerful. Earlier on in the chat, I think it was Kirsten Merrick was saying, can we really overcome the harms that have been created? I don't think that's the answer is probably no, but there's much that we can do. And thank you for your insights around who decides and some of those rules and some of the, you can see in the chat, some of the resources that kind of pull those out in more detail. So we'll loop back with you. And Mike, there's not all of us spend all day long in this work and trying to really understand where are we in this particular process as we're getting ready for a second tranche. And there's some confusion around Build Back Better. Was that a setback, for what's available to folks? Wondering if you might be able to kind of help us understand where we are in this process, what you're learning and what you'd like to see, or as National League of Cities like to see more of.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's helpful just to remind ourselves why the American Rescue Plan Act it isn't just another emergency spending bill, but really a landmark piece of legislation that changes the approach for cities and for the federal government. So in times of economic crisis, economic decline, cities have a fairly conventional playbook for how to respond. They don't have a lot of extra tools. When revenue falls, cities know how to cut, local governments know how to cut, right? So they cut and delay capital projects, institute hiring freezes, furlough, lay off staffs, cut whatever services they may have. And if you look at the Great Recession driven by the subprime mortgage crisis 10 years ago, when that happened, you see the conventional response, right? So a recovery, emergency spending bill gets passed, but it's really top down, managed from a couple federal agencies. It doesn't particularly empower people who've been impacted most by the crisis in any way. And the fact is, for cities, many of them in that crisis didn't even get to the recovery phase. They just made adjustments to live within a more difficult set of circumstances. Because for cities, the conventional playbook says when there's a crisis, an economic crisis, you do everything you can to make sure that you don't have to lay off public safety officers, right? So police, fire, EMS, those folks who sort of deal with immediate crises, those are usually the priority. So who does get laid off? People in the planning departments, the community development departments, the economic development departments, all the sort of places that have the capacities that you need for recovery and renewal. Those are the first ones to fall when there's a crisis. So what's new about the Rescue Plan Act, right? For the first time in decades, maybe ever, the American Rescue Plan Act doesn't treat cities like it's part of the problem. That is part of the problem that needs to be solved with legislation. It treats local governments like they're going to need to be part of the solution to the crisis we have at hand. That's both the COVID public health crisis, but also the economic crisis that really exposed as a result how many residents have been living paycheck to paycheck, have been living one setback away from a major crisis. Folks that have been largely invisible in a lot of ways from the perspective of local elected officials have become very visible. And I think that's one of the opportunities for local governments sort of in this crisis. The Rescue Plan Act and the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, it's offering dollars to local governments in 2 tranches. Most cities and towns have their first tranche, and we've been researching how they've spent it. And it's not surprising to say, for this first tranche, cities and towns mostly are spending in familiar ways, and they're spending in ways that respond to the immediate crisis at hand. So we looked at, for instance, every city under 50,000. What we're seeing is current expenditures, about 75% of them are going toward infrastructure, even though we just passed an infrastructure. That because cities, when the crisis hit, put off those capital projects, put off water plant and water treatment improvements, put off Main Street improvements, whatever they happen to be working on. Those things got sidelined. And so their first instinct was to do the familiar thing and bring those projects back online. And that's what we've seen. In terms of the other categories of spending, about 7% like improving data collection and analysis systems, things on that order. About 6% have spent on community aid, 4% on housing, 2.5% on workforce and economic development. That's the opposite of what we'd really like to see, right? There's an infrastructure bill out there. The ARPA is really flexible and innovative. It significantly reduces barriers to participation for impacted residents and disproportionately impacted residents, right? So while the CARES Act or other past because cities are, living on these stringent budgets, there's been an emphasis to make sure that help is getting to people who need it most. And that has created lots of barriers to people who need help, but may not be the most needy people in the community, or it creates these paperwork burdens for people. Slows things down. Like, these are sort of the things that cities are working to overcome. Now that they have these dollars, it's possible. The bright side here, though, is Boston University. They do a Menino Mayor Survey every year, and their survey of mayors, and these are the bigger city mayors, showed that their intent is to spend these dollars on transformative projects and aims on housing, homelessness, equity issues, and infrastructure, right? So that's good. That doesn't necessarily mean they know how to accomplish that. That doesn't necessarily mean they know how to achieve outcomes that are equitable across the board. But it shows that we're in a time where local elected officials really want to do that work and want to put that in place. And I think that's where a lot of the organizations on the call here today can really play a role in helping provide that kind of insight and technical assistance to local governments where they may not have it, to get them to there. So at NLC, we've been encouraging cities to do much more deeper engagement with residents before they commit to a spending plan, to do asset mapping to see what they have, to see where, who has been most impacted and harmed by COVID-related losses in their community, and to make sure that those folks are part of the plan. But if you think about it, that's really time-intensive work. It's employee-intensive work, and it's happening in a short period of time. So you go for a city who are just laying off people, cutting back, suddenly getting ARPA and being told by many corners of Washington, you got to spend this, you got to show some results, we got to show that we did the right thing here by passing this. Well, quick spending is not the same thing as wise spending. So here's what I think the opportunity is. The first tranche is out. The first tranche has been spent addressing these emergencies, these immediate needs, restoring government operations and services, that sort of thing. Our message on the second tranche is that this is really the opportunity to think bigger than that. In many ways, cities are being asked to do things they've never done in the past, especially smaller community cities. They may not have considered intervening in personal household decline as one of their public duties or one of their public responsibilities. Big cities have housing programs, and hunger programs and so forth. But even moderately sized cities, many of them don't. And part of that has to do with the inability to address capacity decline stemming from decades ago. I mean, right before COVID hit, it took 10 years for cities to build their budgets back to where they were prior to the Great Recession. And just as they got built back, COVID, right? And then the decline again. So in many of these places, you can't do it all, right? And they may not be able to hire on permanent staff to improve their capacity. But that's why it's even more important for community stakeholders like yourselves to step in and offer to provide that kind of capacity, at least while these dollars are present, because these are limited dollars. We may never see something like this again, where every community has the chance to do something transformative with these federal resources. So what we're telling cities, what NLC's put together, it's called a playbook. The state and local fiscal recovery funds playbook. We're saying, throw out the old playbook, throw out the conventional playbook. This is something new. It's time to adopt a new playbook to chart your path forward out of the recovery into renewal. And that means doing lots of things that cities probably haven't done in the past, but that are permitted and encouraged by the final rule from the Treasury Department that specifically makes it much easier to target dollars to impacted and disproportionately impacted residents. And so, so I think that's our main goal for this second tranche, to see those numbers flip. You know, let infrastructure bills spend on infrastructure funding. Cities ought to be doing things on housing, community development, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Super helpful, Mike, and monitoring the chat there. Thank you for the active chat and some ideas that really parallel some of that conversation around this opportunity around infrastructure, but really pivoting to some other bolder investments as well. So Karen, Georgia Health Policy Center, I'd love to just bring you into the conversation and how you're seeing both this moment and opportunities, particularly for intermediaries.
Okay. I like what you're saying, Mike, about focusing on the second tranche, because one of the things I hear people saying is, oh, it's all been decided, we don't have an opportunity, but we do have an opportunity. And like you said, it's unprecedented for us in the United States to have this local funding. And Sarah, you said there's ample opportunity, and this whole issue of who decides. And in our principles of working on trying to understand this opportunity and to help other people understand it and navigate it, we've thought about these principles of aligning for equity first, and thinking about a master plan, a long-term plan, and also this issue of the importance of community voice in the decision-making and the role of intermediaries. And at first we were thinking about the intermediaries, oh, the state and local folks are not going to be able to spend the money first. They're going to need fast enough. They're going to need fiscal intermediaries to help them. And we thought of it as a money thing. But as we've gotten into it and talked to people, we've understood that there are other roles besides the fiscal intermediary, like an administrative intermediary. One of our partners wants to do some landscape analysis and assemble some resources and make sure they're available to their partners. Also the opportunity of convening and bringing people together to think about what they want and doing the planning, and then also thinking about the messaging. One thing that we've heard from communities is that perhaps they don't have the capacity right now, in part because of some of the things Mike said, to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. And so we have put together and are continuing to put together a range of support products. One is just a general overview of what are the principles that you might think of related to this money, and where is the money and how might you start thinking about it, or being able to tailor that information to specific organizations and help them think about how they might navigate. And also we are developing a funding navigator training. We're going to be piloting that in California, probably next month or the month after, but this is an opportunity for people to be able to learn what's there and be able to help with navigation, and maybe even help with some capacity that people in communities might need in order, I mean, they know what they want, but they might not fully know how to navigate the system to get the money that they need to do it. And then some specific technical assistance support to some particular folks who need a deeper dive. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities. I was going to give one example of a blending and braiding example. This is an example from my home state, Georgia, and actually the community where I lived for a number of years. They decided to use their American Rescue Plan money to increase affordable housing. And they were going to do this by building new rental units and renovating existing units. And the Knight Foundation there in Macon decided to match the federal funds. So they were able to blend those together and put it all together as part of an $18 million plan to help the community that included housing, food deserts, blight, and more. And so they're really getting at thinking forward in this resource with these resources, and also thinking about issues that have to do with those most impacted by the challenges, and also leveraging the resources. And so that's one example. but we see more and more examples emerging. A part of our work is to catalog some of these examples, and in addition to what Mike described as the city database, additional examples of things that are happening. And also, we're creating a database that will make it easier for people to see. And when I think about what you would, there's a process that people might go through as they navigate. One is understanding, what county am I in? What cities are part of it? Who in my community has resources? What are the programs and people who are assembled and ready to move, or maybe need to be assembled, and kind of thinking about it in that way, and then looking at where's the money, who's deciding about the money, what opportunity do you have to influence, who do you know? And then thinking about not only the local, but the state. In some cases, the state resources have been allocated, but in other cases, they have not. And sometimes there are RFPs. There's a difference across states of whether the legislature or the governor has the opportunity to decide. So there's that. And then there is all the different notices of funding that are at the different agencies in the federal government. And some of those might be appropriate to pursue, so that so if you think about putting together any kind of, at the federal agency level, any kind of state, any kind of county, any kind of city or town resources, along with perhaps philanthropic or even other sources of money that are available, there is a incredible opportunity for people to think beyond just filling the initial holes that we see from the pandemic and moving into this way of thinking more broadly. And I think that's been the theme from Shoma, from Monty, from Sarah, from Mike, is helping people to say, oh, we have an opportunity to look forward. We have an opportunity to address some things. We don't want the same old distribution of these resources. We want it to be something that builds our local capacity, that builds our civic muscle, and using the intermediary concept is a way to perhaps build some capacity in communities, this fiscal opportunity to build some of that civic muscle going forward, which would be a great investment.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. A nice way to kind of start to bring us to a close here. And I don't know, Sarah or Mike, if there's 30 more seconds, anything else, parting thought? I know we're a little short on time that you want to add or double click on as we start to move to kind of some next steps.
Sarah, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Just reference, we work closely with Dr. Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California, and he's done a lot of research with Chris Benner, showing that regions that know together grow together, that basically the process of coming together, somebody mentioned around like metrics, outcomes that we want to see working together towards those outcomes, they do have more shared prosperity. So I think that that is the opportunity, that there are a lot of processes that are still in play, and that creates an opportunity to build trust, that things can change, and build relationships that will change things.
Yeah, and I realized I didn't say much about Build Back Better. One of the things we saw with the Rescue Plan Act is it really impacts the mindset of local officials, local government officials, whether it appears resources and investments on the horizon or if it's not. And like I said, right until Congress actually passed the Rescue Plan Act, a lot of cities were still in cut back mode. And those cuts always hit the most marginalized residents hardest, because they're the ones who rely most on public services. So I think that there's one set of considerations. There's a political, is Congress going to move something? I think they're going to be successful in moving something. one thing I would say, just in terms of prioritizing which eligible expenditures to make, and thinking about the Build Back Better Act, it had a tremendous amount of funding for new affordable housing. So many program outcomes really rely on housing, right? It's a prerequisite for job security. If you're investing in skills and workforce, if the people in your program don't have stable housing, as soon as they lose it, they're not going to show up to that job or show up to that training. And then all the public investment you've made is lost in that person, because then they have credit problems or whatever, what have you. It's much more difficult to get back into the system. And so whether it's through the Build Back Better Act, or whether it's through the use of ARPA, local fiscal recovery, state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars, it all starts really with stable housing. And I think that's where we ought to be really focused right now, because once you have that, then we can talk about people who are unbanked, right? And how to get them access to those services and access to credit that are really essential for economic mobility. If you don't have a bank, you're not going to be on a track. You're not doing things that are necessary for economic mobility. It's not going to happen. So, those are the fundamentals that I think you can do with ARPA, and we should be doing them. We should not be waiting for the Build Back Better Act, but we also still need it.
Well, thank you for that, Mike, and Karen and Sarah, for being here and all that you and your organizations are doing. And, there's so much goodness in this chat and wisdom in what you all have shared. So we will be looping back with everybody, kind of capturing both this with video and some of the resources that were in the chat, and also setting the stage for part 2 with communities. There's so many takeaways here that, this short period of time, I'm not able to summarize all of them, but I do think, Sarah, this point of who decides, whose voice, and Shoma reminding us of really who are the system stewards. We all have opportunities to be system stewards. And really, with this second tranche, there is an extraordinary opportunity to kind of move outside of business as usual, actually to disrupt what business as usual looks like, to be positive, innovative disruptors. And there's ample opportunity. This is the moment that we all need to lean in together. So we'll continue to curate through the Thriving Together lens, and would really invite all of you to continue to give us resources, stories, ideas, so we can continue to lift those up and learn together, and really set the stage for ongoing learning, including our March 3rd meeting. And so again, just really thank everybody for being here, for all that you're doing at this really remarkable moment in our community and history time, and our opportunity to create a more just and thriving place. So thank you all. And I think there's actually a link that Elizabeth or others may be sharing here in a moment, that, the March 3rd registration. And again, invite folks to also, a little bit of a evaluation opportunity to give us some input on what you'd like to see coming up in the future. But again, thanks so much for being here and spending part of your day and all that you're doing.